just want it. Can you see myself? Can you see myself? Can you see myself?
16th century Scottish King James IV considered himself a man of taste, dedicated to the awakening of knowledge that was sweeping Renaissance Europe. He spared no expense, trying to make his court a cultural center of the new age. Unfortunately, James turned out to be a pretentious spendthrift and was soon to be taken for a fool. Nothing was too expensive to create the image James wanted. To celebrate his marriage, the king gave every member of his court expensive new clothes. The chief cook's outfit alone cost almost $1,000. James was pleased with his ostentation, but the royal treasurer had headaches trying to balance the budget on an accounting device called the Exchequer Board. The treasurer warned the king he was running low on money. Rather than modify his lavish lifestyle, James turned to one of his passions, the newly fashionable interest in chemistry. At the same time, an Italian alchemist named John de Falaise Damien arrived at the Scottish court. He told James he had the answer to all his problems. Through much travel and experimentation, Damien declared he was within reach of discovering the material that would turn metal into gold. He also claimed it had the added benefit of being the key to eternal life. King James was impressed and set Damien up in a laboratory at Stirling Castle. He instructed his beleaguered treasurer to furnish Damien with all the money and supplies he needed. Damien's requests soon poured in.
Item, the 13th of October. For a skin of wine to make the quintessence, £6.
Besides wine, Damien also asked for borax, quicksilver, and, most importantly, large quantities of aqua vita, more commonly known as whiskey. Consulting ancient texts, Damien mixed and blended and heated and cooled the ingredients. But the magical potion eluded him. The Italian alchemist couldn't produce the quintessence. The king wasn't bothered, for he enjoyed the charming Damien as a companion. Ignoring his quest for the magic potion, Damien spent much of his time playing cards with the king. The king, however, was not a good card player.
Item, that night £6 and 12 shillings to play cards with the alchemist Damien.
Members of the royal court began to complain about Damien. Rather than making the king rich, he was taking James's money at every opportunity. And Damien still couldn't come up with the potion to turn metal into gold. As Damien's confidence grew, his greed became outrageous. He constantly borrowed money from James and never bothered to repay the loans. The king's weary treasurer had to record,
Item, lent by the king's command to the alchemist Damien, and cannot be gotten from him. £33, 6 and 8 pence.
The huge quantities of aqua vita Damien ordered for his experiments were going straight down his throat instead of into the alchemist's crucible. His experiments were actually distillation to make his whiskey stronger. The buzz in the Scottish court finally made King James realize Damien was little more than an alcoholic charlatan. The king ordered his treasurer to cut off Damien's payments. With his fortunes at their lowest ebb, Damien insisted on one last chance to prove his magic powers. He confidently announced that he could fly. He would prove it by flying from Stirling Castle to Paris the following Sunday. When the great day dawned, a crowd of eager spectators gathered to witness the world's first manned flight. Meanwhile, Damien was in his laboratory, gluing feathers on his flying machine and fortifying himself for the coming ordeal. When all was complete and ready, Scotland's first birdman presented himself to the crowd gathered below. He began to flap his wings, faster and faster. Damien's attempt at flight ended a few yards from the castle walls. He broke his leg, but was otherwise unhurt. Luckily, the alchemist had landed in a soft heap of stinking dung. Damien's fall from grace now seemed certain, but he had a ready explanation for the failed flight. He insisted chicken feathers had been mistakenly mixed in with eagle feathers. Since chickens prefer the dung heap to the blue sky, the flight had been doomed to failure. King James was completely satisfied with Damien's bird-brained explanation and welcomed his favorite wizard back to the royal court. James of Scotland's weakness for the alcoholic alchemist cost his kingdom a fortune. But the misguided rule of Charles VI of Austria nearly cost his kingdom much more: its very existence. From the start of Charles's reign, he showed little sign of being a great ruler. Instead, he led his nation inexorably towards total disaster. It all started in 1711, when Charles succeeded his brother Joseph, who at the age of 33 died suddenly of smallpox. Joseph had left no heir, so the throne and the burden of continuing the royal line passed to his brother Charles. Charles was 26 years old and had just married a 16-year-old girl, so his hopes were high of producing a male heir to the throne. To the rest of the world, Austria was a rich and mighty empire ruled by the most powerful family in Europe, the Habsburgs. And rich and mighty is how the pious and pompous Charles chose to see his empire too. But beneath the gilded veneer, the empire was fragile, fragmented, and bankrupt. In his first great act of folly, Charles ordered lavish new buildings to be added to his royal palace in Vienna, so he could house his 2,000 courtiers and 30,000 hangers-on. Charles was a fanatic for elaborate court ritual. He wore an uncomfortable formal costume and a long wig, topped by a heavily plumed hat, a ridiculous and unfashionable outfit for the elegant Vienna of the day. And he was so nervous that he hid his anxiety behind a severe and unsmiling facade. No one could approach His Royal Majesty without bowing so low his head virtually scraped the floor. When the smallpox plague that had struck down his brother returned years later to ravage his people, Charles left the fate of his subjects in the hands of the Lord and built an enormously ornate memorial church, which he named after himself, the Karlskirche. Here the devout Charles would pray, so much so that the French ambassador wrote home,
"Only a monk could endure this life. I have spent altogether between Palm Sunday and Easter Wednesday over 100 hours with the king in church."
But the king was not praying for personal salvation, but for the much coveted male heir he had already spent years trying to secure. He'd had high hopes of his young wife, and her first child was a boy, but he died in infancy. Then 2 girls were born, but under Austrian law no woman could inherit the throne. His efforts seemed fruitless. His brother's sudden and childless death began to haunt him as his quest for a male heir faltered. The king tried everything to produce a son. Doctors ordered his wife to eat nothing but cakes, pies, and heavy puddings. But this just made her put on weight. Then he ordered her rooms to be decorated with erotic art, but to no avail. His wife had no more children. If he could not produce a son and heir to the Habsburg throne, then he had to find another solution. Without a son, he was determined that his daughter should have the right to succeed him. He turned to diplomacy. It was to be his greatest folly. He drafted a legal document granting the succession to his daughter, Maria Theresa. It became known as the Pragmatic Sanction. Charles knew that few people would accept his daughter as his heir. He resolved then that his life's work would be to persuade not only his subjects, but also the rest of Europe of the wisdom of his decision. He refused to consult his advisors and presented his plans straight to his commander-in-chief, Prince Eugene of Savoy. Eugene told him the plan was bound to fail. Other European royals wanted him to die without an heir, so they could make their own claims upon his empire. No, said Prince Eugene, the answer was to build up a powerful army which could repel invaders if they attacked Austria after Charles's death. And he reminded the king of the present state of national defense.
The state of the army is well known to your majesty. Most of the soldiers have neither clothes nor money. The officers are poor as beggars. Many are dying. None of the fortresses have supplies.
Prince Eugene also warned the king that powerful neighbors like King Frederick William of Prussia spent nothing on their courts and everything on their armies. But Charles much preferred to see the royal horses prance and dance in his famous Spanish riding school and to house them in a real Renaissance palace than to have them practicing maneuvers on the battlefield like the Prussians. Charles ignored his commander-in-chief's advice and began his diplomatic offensive. His first task, to persuade the members of the Habsburg Empire to accept his daughter as heir, was achieved with surprisingly little struggle. But it was won at a price. He agreed to reduce taxes, which began emptying a treasury already dangerously depleted by his extravagant building plans. Persuading the rest of Europe to follow suit proved a more daunting task. Charles was to dedicate the next 25 years of his reign to touring Europe, beseeching all his fellow monarchs to accept his daughter, Maria Theresa, as his legitimate heir. In return, he was asked for cash, for land, for concessions, and Austria's support in rival disputes. The more signatures he got, the more he had to pay out, ruining the already overtaxed royal treasury. And the more signatures he got, the clearer it was to his rivals that the Austrian Empire was growing weaker. Then he was forced to go to war, because he'd promised his army to help the countries who'd signed his Pragmatic Sanction. Twice his armies took to the field, and twice they were beaten. They were in such poor shape. The royal coffers were emptying faster than they could be filled. All of Europe could see that Austria was on its knees, except for its king. But by 1740, Charles had completed his collection of European royal signatures and sincerely believed his succession was secure. Later that year, Charles went on a prolonged hunting trip in freezing winter weather. It was to be his final act of sheer folly. Soaked through and chilled to the bone, the king decided to revive himself with a steaming bowl of mushroom stew. The mushrooms were poisonous. Within a few days, Charles VI of Austria was dead. He was only 55 years old. In accordance with Charles's plans, Maria Theresa did indeed succeed to the Austrian throne. But he had left her with no money and nothing more than a meaningless piece of paper to defend herself. As she put it, she was
without money, without credit, without army, without experience and knowledge of my own, and also without any advice. It seemed everything was in a state of utter confusion and chaos. It was not difficult to see that if things continued as they were, the monarchy would not survive much longer.
Within a month, Austria had paid for Charles's ultimate folly. Frederick the Great of Prussia demonstrated the real value of all Charles's efforts over 25 years by seizing Silesia, Austria's richest province and the source of a quarter of all Austria's tax revenues. Queen Maria Theresa showed more sense than her father, and fate was kinder to her. Not only did she survive to rebuild the Austrian Empire, but she bore no less than 16 healthy children, 4 of whom were male. Her succession was secure. Austrian Queen Maria Theresa managed to survive her father's follies, but in 11th century Sicily, another queen made one foolish decision that ruined her life. This is the tomb of Adelaide, Countess of Sicily. In 1089, Adelaide married the Norman Count Roger I. Roger had invaded the island with a small force and stamped his austere Norman mark on the land by raising stone castles and fortified churches. But Roger suddenly died in 1101, and Adelaide had to rule Sicily on behalf of her then 8-year-old son, Roger II. Countess Adelaide faced formidable obstacles to her rule. She was alone, a foreigner in a strange land, and a woman. But Adelaide created a golden age for her island nation. Rejecting the stern, insular, violent rule of the colonizing Normans, Adelaide instituted a more sophisticated and enlightened reign. Sicily was a naturally rich island with plentiful grains, fruit and vegetables. The seas around its shores teemed with fish. And it stood at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. Here, the peoples of Europe mingled with the Arab cultures of North Africa and Arabia and the gilded empire of Byzantium. The island was full of foreign travelers, merchants, and scholars. Adelaide realized this variety of talent could be harnessed for her own good. She employed all comers, Arabs, Moors, Greeks, who had something to offer. Sicily blossomed and became the richest and most cosmopolitan province in the whole Mediterranean. Adelaide's rule was a great success. But Adelaide's son Roger was growing up and would soon want to rule Sicily himself. It was time for Countess Adelaide to find a new husband. Adelaide was a desirable bride, powerful, sophisticated, and above all, rich. She could have taken her pick of available princes, but she made an unlikely choice. Baldwin, the Norman king of Jerusalem. Still only a countess, Adelaide foolishly accepted King Baldwin's proposal because she wanted the ultimate title of Queen. Baldwin also promised that her son Roger would in turn become King of Jerusalem. She would live to regret her decision. Adelaide left Sicily for her wedding carrying an enormous treasure trove, the largest dowry assembled since Cleopatra married Mark Antony. But she should have asked the King of Jerusalem for references before she started her journey. What she apparently didn't know was that her destination, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, was a bankrupt war zone, and that her future husband, King Baldwin, was a scoundrel. It was the time of the Crusades, and Baldwin's Christian soldiers were steadily losing the war against the Muslim Saracens. The king had run out of money, and Jerusalem was teeming with crusaders demanding payment for their services. As Adelaide's fleet approached the barren, rocky shores of the Holy Land, King Baldwin and his court were waiting to escort her, and to relieve her of her huge, glittering dowry. The couple were married, but their honeymoon was short. Within months, the gold, silver, and precious stones were all gone. Adelaide's magnificent dowry was all paid out to the Crusader knights to keep them quiet. Baldwin was now safer on his throne, but just as penniless. Gradually, the truth about King Baldwin dawned on Adelaide. It was painfully clear her royal husband was only interested in her dowry. With the money gone, Baldwin wanted to rid himself of her. But Baldwin had saved his nastiest surprise for last. He revealed that in his rush to marry, he forgot he already had another wife. King Baldwin asked the Pope to annul his marriage to Adelaide, and the Pope obliged by dissolving the union. Adelaide now wasn't rich, she wasn't a queen, and she wasn't wanted in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Baldwin sent her back home to Sicily. Ruined and deceived by a bankrupt bigamist, there was little left for Adelaide to do but pray fervently for revenge. Revenge came a generation later from Adelaide's son Roger. As King of Sicily, Roger II had restored the island's fortunes and built magnificent churches and palaces. Wielding his royal power, Roger prohibited crusaders from stopping in Sicily on their way to defend King Baldwin and the Holy Land. Baldwin began losing his army, and a few years later, Jerusalem fell to the Muslims. Baldwin's kingdom was no more. As for Adelaide, she died alone and was buried here in a tiny Sicilian village, never knowing her son's vengeance would be so thorough and so sweet. Countess Adelaide of Sicily, Scottish James IV, Austrian Charles VI. These monarchs were all foolish in their own ways. But they all attested to the basic truth: there was no greater fool than a royal fool. For a fool. Nothing was too expensive to create the image James wanted. To celebrate his marriage, the king gave every member of his court expensive new clothes. The chief cook's outfit alone cost almost $1,000. James was pleased with his ostentation, but the royal treasurer had headaches trying to balance the budget on an accounting device called the Exchequer Board. The treasurer warned the king he was running low on money. Rather than modify his lavish lifestyle, James turned to one of his chemists couldn't produce the quintessence. The king wasn't bothered, for he enjoyed the charming Damien as a companion. Ignoring his quest for the magic potion, Damien spent much of his time playing cards with the king. The king, however, was not a good card player.
Item. That night, £6 and 12 shillings to play cards with the alchemist Damien.
Members of the royal court began to complain about Damien. Rather than making the king rich, he was taking James's money at every opportunity. And Damien still couldn't come up with the potion to turn metal into gold he needed. Damien's requests soon poured in.
Item, the 13th of October. For a skin of wine to make the quintessence, £6.
Besides wine, Damien also asked for borax, quicksilver, and, most importantly, large quantities of aqua vita, more commonly known as whiskey. Consulting ancient texts, Damien mixed and blended and heated and cooled the ingredients. But the magical potion eluded him. The Italian alchemists, the newly fashionable interest in chemistry. At the same time, an Italian alchemist named John de Falaise Damien arrived at the Scottish court. He told James he had the answer to all his problems. Through much travel and experimentation, Damien declared he was within reach of discovering the material that would turn metal into gold. He also claimed it had the added benefit of being the key to eternal life. King James was impressed and set Damien up in a laboratory at Stirling Castle. He instructed his beleaguered treasurer to furnish Damien with all the money and supplies.
I just want it. Can you see myself? Can you see myself? Can you see myself?
16th century Scottish King James IV considered himself a man of taste, dedicated to the awakening of knowledge that was sweeping Renaissance Europe. He spared no expense, trying to make his court a cultural center of the new age. Unfortunately, James turned out to be a pretentious spendthrift and was soon to be taken